drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor early in the morning? This stuff is very messy to work with. You are going to get a lot of drips and runs. Don't worry about it. You can always sand them off later. This stuff sets up quickly. You've got to work fast. So don't sweat the small stuff. If you do, it's just going to be a lot of extra work down the road. You're going to waste a lot of materials. I haven't worked with this stuff in years, so I'm a little bit rusty, and so I fully expect to waste some material and have it set up a little bit too fast on me before I'm done, until I get back into the groove. Try to keep your resin out of the sun. Try to use shallow containers, because it will not, when you have it in a deep container, it sets up pretty fast, and it doesn't set up quite as quickly in a shallow container. It doesn't build as much heat. The chemical reaction does generate heat, and that just accelerates the cure time. So, and that's another reason why I really shouldn't be doing this in direct sunlight, but it's the only place I have to work at the moment, so I just have to make do. And I try to smooth it out as best I can now before I apply more resin. Again, time is of the essence. You're working against the clock here. Once you've got that resin mixed, it's starting to cure. It's already, the chemical reaction is taking place. You just have to play with it. Notice I'm wearing gloves, protective gloves. That's essential. You don't want this stuff on your skin, and it's not healthy. I'll apply more resin on the cloth. Wet it right out. You know you have enough resin when the cloth becomes translucent. It essentially disappears and all you see is the wood underneath for the most part. You can just work it in with the squeegee and wipe off any excess resin, scrape it off. You don't have to, but if you scrape off the excess now, it's a whole lot less sanding, grinding, and extra work down the road. It's just like when you're doing your glue-ups. You wipe off the excess glue so you won't have to cut it all off and grind it down and sand it later. It's the same thing using this resin. Just wipe off any excess as much as possible. You don't want to starve it completely, but... And another thing too is that as long as the cloth is saturated, if it feels a little bit bumpy on the surface when it sets up, meaning it just didn't have enough resin for total, as long as it had good saturation, you can always go back and you can put another coat of resin on later. But you do have to get off the wax, and you have to and sand it in between coats. But if you do that, you're good to go. I'm using polyester resin here rather than epoxy, and when I go to fill this in, I can use a polyester-based auto body type filler such as Bondo. In fact, Bondo, they make a formulation of their plastic filler for wood. Again, this is one of those times where you don't take your time. You just have to boogie. You have to rush. You want to work quickly, but you also want to work efficiently, and you want to be as precise as you can, because if you get an air bubble, that causes weakness in the joint. It also provides a pocket where moisture could build up and get dry rot. And also, if you hit anything solid, that little bubble could fracture and break, and opening up the plywood to further damage. Once you have your glass tape in position, you got your bubbles out, it's right where you want it. You don't want to keep moving this around, because your resin is continually setting up, and it just makes matters worse, and you could end up having to grind the whole thing off and starting over again. So yesterday I went and I applied the fiberglass tape, and then late yesterday afternoon, early evening, I came out and I washed it down. I scrubbed it with hot soapy water, and rinsed it off with some clear water to get most of that waxy substance off. Can't get it all off. And then I gave it a good sanding, just roughly on the surface. I didn't try to fair it, I just wanted to rough up the surface. And that gunks up your sandpaper, but that'll only happen that one time. And before I go any further, it's just so hot out. If I mix up any fillers, it's just going to click off on me very quickly because I got the hot sun on me. So I'll probably do that later in the afternoon. I took this scrap piece of 1/4-inch plywood, and I'm using the factory cut edge. And what I did is I marked the center line, both at the transom and at the stem, and I placed this right on the mark. Then what I did is I made a pencil mark right along here, and that marks the center line. And what I'm going to do from there is I will then measure over 3/8 of an inch on this side and also on the other side of the center line, and draw in those lines, because that'll give me a guide to place my keel, which is nothing but a 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch strip of spruce ripped from a KD stud. And then what I'll do is I'll be placing this down where it's supposed to go, using those lines as a guide, and I'll weight it down and I'll figure out where I'm going to put my screw holes. The screws for the keel, there'll be one at the transom, one at the main frame, one up forward at the stem, and that, along with a few weights and some glue, will hold it in place. But what I'm going to do is, before I do that, right along the center line that I just drew, I'll be drilling a few holes along here, maybe about 6 inches apart, 8 inches apart, and those holes will be guides for me when this keel is set up and I turn the boat over. I'll be able to, I'll see those holes, I'll be able to run a pilot drill in there with a countersink, and then I will back up the fastening of this keel with a few stainless steel screws countersunk into the wood. And so that's how this will be applied. And then there'll be a small skeg on the back here, which you really don't need if you were building this as a power boat, but this is for rowing, and the skeg helps give you more directional stability. You need to bed something, some kind of adhesive, so that it's bedded against the hull, so you don't get any water underneath there. Because that would, when the dinghy's out of the water, you get air and water under there and it starts dry rotting, and you want to prevent that. So at least use some sort of waterproof adhesive. I'll go ahead and just put this on. I've already put on the false stem. The false stem, all that is just a piece of protective hardwood, a hardwood strip that is glued and screwed right to the front of the stem, and it also covers the forward edges of the side panel plywood to protect those edges. So just as we're using this fiberglass tape to protect the edges of the side panels along the sides of the boat and the bottom panel as well, we're using that false stem. I didn't get that on camera, but it was just a strip of wood that's glued and screwed into place and then sanded and shaped to blend in with the hull. And I did take a couple of still photos, and I'll include that. Turn the boat on its side, and I'm going to put the drill and countersink through the pilot holes for the screws that go through the hull and into the keel strip. Starting to look like something now, but I guess I'm just going to have to turn it right side up because it won't stay sideways. And for this operation, I'm just using some number 6 by 3/4 stainless steel screws. They're all flathead. type of screws I'm using were really intended for sheet metal, but they actually work quite well for plywood boat construction, and they're fairly inexpensive. It's not a very high grade of stainless steel, but seeing how it gets buried in epoxy, it does the trick and saves a lot of money. Okay, and I'll turn the boat over again because I'm still not finished yet with the bottom before I'm ready to start on the inside. And I still have this temporary brace in place. It's really not necessary right now, but it just makes it easier when I'm moving the boat around and I'm all by myself. And I don't have anybody to help out. The boat's not that heavy, but it's bulky and it's a little bit awkward to move around. I'm going to fabricate a skeg. It's just a little fin on the back, and you don't need it for a power boat, but for rowing it helps add directional stability, and it's a good thing to have. And it doesn't have to be huge, and I'm not even going according to my own plans. I'm just going to make one up. You have a little bit of curvature to the hull, and you want to be able to fit it. See, it's rocking. You want it to fit it to the keel. It's going to sit right on top of the keel. This is just a piece of scrap wood I had in the shop, left over from something else. And it's the proper width. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it right up against the keel, and the end of it against the back of the transom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace a line on here, and that gives me a little bit of curvature. I can just cut that out on my bandsaw and sand it. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it'll be good enough when I put the bedding compound in there. And what I'm going to do now is what's my skeg going to look like? Well, I'm going to continue that angle up here. So I'll get my bevel gauge and I'll continue that angle. I don't have a whole lot of wood here, so this skeg is not going to be as big as I normally make them, or as deep I should say, but I'll run it the whole length of this wood. I'm going to bring it right on down, a little bit of a curve. I'll draw that in a little bit deeper, I'll figure it out. I lay it flat. But I can cut all this out, mount it on here with a little bit of compound and some screws. You can now see I have the skeg cut out and fitted. And that's all we really need for a small rowing dinghy, and that'll work out just fine. So we'll just glue it and screw it in place, and that part of the operation is done, and then onwards to the fairing of the hull.
What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor?